We are joined by Senator Eric Schmitt of Missouri. He was formerly the Missouri Attorney General. That's particularly important because there's a case being heard today by the Supreme Court that Senator Schmitt has said is the most important free speech case in the history of the country. Senator Schmitt, appreciate you being with us, sir.
Great to be with you guys again.
Could you just give everybody the background on this so they understand what this case is and your role in bringing it, this case that's being heard today by the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so I think if people take a step back in time a little bit and remember the government's desire to control the narrative, especially during COVID, but there were certainly instances outside of that. And you saw Jen Psaki at the podium saying we're flagging posts for Facebook. You saw Joe Biden saying that these social media platforms were killing people because, information about whether it was masking or origins of COVID was different than what the narrative of the Biden administration was. And then, remember, they also created something called the Disinformation Governance Board. This was all public. And so in May of 2022, when I was the AG in Missouri, we filed a lawsuit, Missouri versus Biden. And one of the things that's really important is we were able to get discovery, meaning we were able to get emails, text messages before the preliminary injunction hearing. And why is that important? Because what we discovered was a sprawling, vast censorship enterprise that wasn't just a couple government officials working with social media companies, but a leviathan of agencies and individuals, the Surgeon General of the United States, high-ranking government officials basically saying, take this down or else. And then that sort of happened around that time frame. Then Elon Musk, of course, buys Twitter. You have the Twitter files, you have the congressional hearings, and all this stuff is now out there for the world to see. And the reality is, we all know that, traditional First Amendment law is that the government doesn't get to suppress your speech. It doesn't get to censor you in the town square. Well, now we've moved into an era of a virtual town square. In this case, sort of stands for the proposition, does the government get to coerce social media companies and threaten them with taking away Section 230 protections or investigations if they don't do their bidding? So the government can't censorship. They also can't engage in censorship. They also can't outsource that either. And that's what's being argued today in front of the Supreme Court.
Okay, so for people out there who have paid attention to the history of the First Amendment, probably the most significant case in the last 60 years is New York Times v. Sullivan. And that case regarding the First Amendment was written in an entirely different media ecosystem than the one in which we live today. In your mind, what should the Supreme Court do here? Should they scrap a lot of historic First Amendment jurisprudence? What, in your mind, would be an ideal result if you were solving not only this case, but as you well know, Senator and formerly Attorney General, you have to build the entire presidential landscape based on this for a generation to come, potentially, in what is still a relatively new internet world. So what should the result be here in your mind?
I think it's really updating into the digital age what it means to be a state actor, right? And so, if a private company like Facebook or Twitter takes down a post because it violates their terms of service, we may not like that, but that's not government censorship. Now, I would argue they should lose their Section 230 protections, which is you can't be sued because in 1996, when the internet was kind of brand new, Congress said, look, you guys are going to be an open platform. You're not a publisher. You're not making editorial decisions. You can't get sued, right? Because we thought this was going to be a democratization of information. What we've seen since then, guys, is a consolidation of that, and they actually are making these editorial judgments. So, the Section 230 protections, sort of limit their culpability and their liability in these instances. And I think if you engage in that kind of, stuff, you should lose it. But that being said, you're not a government actor. What this case is saying, look, the government, if they're essentially turning these social media companies into an arm of the government to do their bidding, to take posts down, to deplatform people, to censor people, that is a First Amendment violation because that can only come when the government's acting. So I think basically you're updating what First Amendment law is in the digital age. And I think that's a very important thing. And also, I mentioned we were able to get this discovery. We found and if we weren't able to get it, and Elon Musk doesn't buy Twitter, all this stuff is still in the dark, guys. And people will be called a conspiracy theorist. What are you talking about? But we know Elvis Chan was debunking, or pre-bunking, I should say, the Hunter Biden laptop story. We know that. They had it in December of 2019. They're going around telling these social media platforms, look out for a Russian hack and leak operation, and they start pre-bunking it. That's a government then sort of under the guise of being the FBI and all the things that can happen, wielding its heavy hand. Then you get into the COVID times, and they have weekly censorship meetings. They have a special portal for government and social media companies. You've got text messages between the Surgeon General and senior Facebook officials saying, take it down. We've taken it down. What else can we do? When you lay all this out in front of the court, you see, again, what we've dubbed as a vast censorship enterprise. They've also outsourced some of this flagging of quote-unquote disinformation and misinformation to places like Stanford and the University of Washington. So they were very engaged in monitoring American speech, and if you got out of line, they were basically going to these social media companies and say, take it down. And the email exchanges are really colorful. Some of them are angry. But behind all of it is the threat of investigations, antitrust lawsuits, and taking away Section 230 protection. So I think that, that kind of coercive impact of the power of the government is what crosses the line here.
Senator Schmitt with us now from Missouri. So Supreme Court hearing this, if they hearing this case today, if they rule properly, obviously we know which way you want them to rule. What will it mean in terms of consequences, and how enforceable do you think they will be when it comes to First Amendment jurisprudence going forward?
Well, I think it'll be a very important proposition to say you can't have this network of government actors working hand in hand under the threat of, again, legal repercussions, silencing Americans, because that's what they were doing. And this wasn't a one-off thing. This was a leviathan of government officials and agencies. And so I think it'll pause that, because really what they're in front of the Supreme Court on right now is this injunctive relief. They got a temporary injunction. The government has appealed that to the Supreme Court. So this ultimately would go back to a trial on the merits, no matter what happens. But a lot of this evidence is already out there. So that's what the court is looking at, because we got all that discovery early on. But, I worry. I mean, they use all these examples, and you heard from one of the justices today, well, this was a once-in-a-lifetime thing. Well, quite frankly, that's what every tyrant or dictator says. There's some emergency, real or perceived, to aggregate, consolidate, and exercise power. And the first thing they usually go for is going after people who are dissenting. And so I think this case really cuts at the core of what it means to be an American. Your ability, your God-given right to express your point of view. And what you're supposed to do with speech you don't agree with is combat it with more speech, not censor speech. And I think that, again, is why this case is so important.
And what you just said there at the end is actually the definition of what liberal thought used to be, and it's
Right.
amazing how illiberal now many people are. Last question for you, and we appreciate everything you've done on this case. We appreciate the time you're giving us now. A lot of people are going to say, okay, and they understand this is a long process, right? It's going to still take potentially years for there to be a resolution on these COVID cases and what the government could or could not do. Do you think your lawsuit will restrict in some ways the aggressiveness that the current government, that is the Biden administration, will bring to bear on social media companies this fall with the election?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The New York Times, speaking of illiberal, so-called liberal points of view, had a hit piece on this, and basically saying that me and the other people who are advocating this are enabling disinformation, right? It's just crazy to me that these people who scream about threats to democracy are willing to bulldoze democracy to get their way. I'm 48. I remember when liberals actually believed in free speech, and they kind of lost the plot here. So they've claimed that this has inhibited their ability to do all the stuff that they want to do, which is good. I think that's a good thing, because, again, the government, you can stand up to the podium, guys, and say, this is what we believe. You just can't coerce other people to censor speech, which is exactly what they've been doing. So I hope so. But again, I've got legislation. There's two things I'll meant to close with this, guys. I think that this has to continue on in the Congress. So in the Senate, I've got two bills. One on the private actor side to say, look, if you're engaged in censorship, at the private level, you're taking down stuff, you lose your Section 230 protections. And if you're a government official, like any one of these people involved, Fauci, Psaki, any of these people, and you're responsible for censoring another American's speech, you can be sued individually by an American, as opposed to being just in your official capacity. I think instead of one attorney general bringing this lawsuit, you have an army of patriots out there saying, I'm not going to be silenced. I think that would do a lot to stop this stuff.
Senator, do you want to give us a prediction? Let's assume that it goes your way. Do you think it ends up being a tight one, or could the liberals see that there's no way that this kind of censorship, liberals on the court, that there's no way this kind of censorship could be allowed to continue?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not trying to like punt on this. I don't know because it's really hard. It's hard from the questions. It's hard to know how people really come down on this. So it's hard to say because this is a brand new kind of case, and I think there's been some favorable rulings on curtailing government overreach recently. I think there's also been some good stuff on social media. So I'm hopeful. But no matter what, I'm very hopeful. But no matter what, the exposing all of this stuff, I think is helping move hearts and minds and people our way, not the media. They're losing control, like the mainstream. They're losing control as the gatekeepers. But for, the average American, I think they're emboldened and believe in the First Amendment and see how it's been abused. And I think that's a good thing for us long term.
I think it goes 6-3. I think Sotomayor probably writes a dissent wearing a mask, and we will see if I'm right on that one. Senator Schmitt,
right. I hope you're right.
Yeah, appreciate you being with us. Thank you, sir.
All right, guys.